Good morning, British and American culture. It's an important class today because this is our last class before we have our first quiz. So let me talk about that first. The instructions are on the website, and I'm going to send a message to remind you, but it's very simple. If you look at the Cyber Campus schedule, the lecture schedule, you will see on Friday at 10 o'clock, there's just this 5 minute uh, login option, okay? And it only goes from 10 o'clock until 10:10. And there's nothing there. There's nothing to watch yet. Okay? So what you have to do is you have to log in at 9:55 and you have to wait. And at 9:59, I'm going to copy and paste the address for the form that I've created the quiz in, which is a Google form. And all you do is just go follow the link, and then there's going to be a Google form there. You put your name and your student number and your email address. You fill out the form, which is a 10 question quiz. At the bottom, you make sure you press submit, and then you're done. Now, to get credit for the attendance, you have to be logged in for 5 minutes. So just, calm down or whatever and wait until the 5 minutes are done. If you finish in 3 minutes and you click it, that's still okay. Don't worry about the Cyber Campus tracking. I can see the timestamps anyway. The most important thing is don't submit your quiz after 10:10. Literally at 10:59, that's it. All right? At 10:10, the quiz is closed and it doesn't reopen. And I'm not going to make another quiz for you. So you have to hit that window from 10 o'clock until 9:59. So you have to submit your answers before 10:10, not at 10:10, before. And then everything's fine. Most students got it last semester. Some students didn't care and kept making mistakes. But if you're careful, I feel nervous because I don't want to make a mistake. If I make a mistake, don't worry about it. But if you just follow the normal procedure, the quiz should just automatically be collected at 10:10, and all of the answers should be provided to me in a neat little graded table, which is nice. So I can just, I can show you your results anytime. I can look them up very easily just by searching by outputting the data immediately. So unlike when I do them by hand, it doesn't take me a week to physically bring them back to the class and give you your quizzes, with your grades on them. That's what I normally do, but this will just process everything automatically. So everybody will know their grades right away, and I can, in the next lecture, I can tell you what the average is. And if you ask me for actually, I'm going to send all of the grades out so make sure your email address is correct, because I can just send all the results out to you. So you'll get your results very quickly by the weekend. It's kind of very efficient. All right? Just make sure you do follow the instructions and there will be no problem. Now, I would like to talk about the content. So we have been talking about mostly about Celtic culture, Roman and Anglo-Saxon culture, from the groups of Angles and Saxons and Jutes. Now, I want to go back for a second to the cultural studies section in the introduction, because I do talk about a few different ways of just kind of getting your head around how culture interacts, because culture is such a big, complicated thing. But there's kind of groups of cultures, and they kind of compete with each other in this big system, right? So this is what's happening what we're talking about right now. Why it's important is because there's kind of layers of culture being created here, and they're mixing together. And when we get to 500 years ago or so, this British identity will start forming from all of these ancient cultures. So the Celtic one is first in its dominance, right? So there's an interaction between the cultures that are there at each time. In the textbook on page 42, I briefly described to you just this way of naming the power structure between cultures. So you have a dominant culture, right? That is the most popular one, that has the most influence and has, money and more resources and more influence and media coverage. They wouldn't have had media back then, but they would have, produced the stories, and the narrative of the culture would have been primarily produced by the dominant one. So at that time, it would have been, the religious type things and the linguistic things and the laws. These are the things that dominant cultures used to keep control of people. And periodically you would have revolts or groups of people that were trying to change the culture, and that would be called a counterculture. Counter means to be against. So Boudica, for example, she actually was part of the dominant culture before the Romans got there, but when the dominant culture started to become Roman, she resisted and she formed a counterculture. It was a violent one. They don't have to be violent, but Boudica was a revolt. They did kill as many Romans as they could, and that was because the Romans were violent to them first. So I'm not saying who's right or wrong here. I'm just saying they resisted the dominant culture and it was crushed. Their revolt was crushed, and then their culture returned kind of to a lower status level within, the Roman influenced land of Britannia, right? Province of Britannia. So they became a subculture. But when you're actively resisting the dominant, powerful culture, you form a counterculture. Lots of examples of countercultures. In music, there's rap music and there's punk music and metal to a certain extent, underground and indie and all these kind of things. The dominant culture in Korea is K-pop. In most countries it's pop, but rock and roll has been dominant, and in America to a certain extent country music has been dominant. So there can be resistance just within parts of culture too. But we're interested in, the big picture here, a very big picture, which is what it means to be British, right? This is what I hope by the end of the semester you have a sense of, like, what Britishness is and why, these things like the royal family and stuff, they seem to just hang around forever, and we wonder, why does everyone watch the Harry and Meghan interview with Oprah, and why does anybody care? Because this history goes back more than 1,000 years, and the relationship between monarchy, culture, government, politics, finance, economics is very complicated, and they are a part of that. They are very symbolic of a basically conservative culture, right? That has its roots in systems that started right back with the Romans and the Celts, with the conflict between the Romans and the Celts. So we got to keep going here because we're going to run out of time. So we're going to pick up here just where I left off, around 600, right? That's when the transition and this real kind of nation building effort started to take shape. So the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes. The Jutes ended up in Kent, which Julius Caesar said, by the way, that it was settled by Belgian immigrants. So there may have been a Celtic connection between the Belgae and the people in Kent. But regardless, the Jutes came over and took over. But despite the stories about invasion and complete, destruction, there's no real evidence. We haven't been able to find architectural evidence and archaeological evidence of archaeological. We haven't been able to find evidence of burnt down houses and massacres and stuff. So basically the Angles and the Saxons came in, and they were a warrior class, and they had powerful influence and the most control. And the languages that were there already, Pictish, Gaelic, Brittonic, and Latin. There were 4 languages already mixing around. Those kind of got dominated, right? They became subcultures of the dominant language of Germanic, which started to become Old English. But all of these other languages still kind of fed into them and influenced them, especially Danish, right? Old Danish and Old English are very similar. So, for example, you get words like that start with th in German and in Scandinavian languages. Koreans don't really like saying those words, the and th, though, there, them, these, right? They. These are all, a lot of them are pronouns. These are Viking words. That's what a Viking would have said. Dere, right? Over there, or that, them, this. These are very basic ways of communicating, and that's how the Vikings, the pronunciation was different, but that's a contribution to our culture, and it's imprinted in our language that we indicated people and things using Danish. So when you get back and you study Old English, you can't understand anything because it really is like a foreign language. There's no French in there yet. There's vocabulary from Celtic words, and there's vocabulary from Brittonic, and there's vocabulary from Danish, and there's German stuff, and it's much more Germanic than it is now. But basically, English is a Germanic word, a Germanic language, and the top 100 words that we use in English are Germanic. So the basic words of our language are Germanic. After the quiz, we'll talk about the next thing, which is going to be the French influence, but that doesn't come yet. That hasn't happened. We're just going up to 1066 today, okay? So remember these things. Read over in the textbook. Remember the important contributions. When the Danish are dominant, they are adding language to us. They have an area that is called the Danelaw, and they add certain laws that are come from the Northmen. They come from the Vikings, and they get incorporated into English culture. And to a certain extent, Scotland starts to form too, because the area that the Romans dominated is replaced by the area that the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms dominate, and they're unable to conquer the northern part. So the Picts sort of give way to the Scots, and the Scots develop Scottish Gaelic, and they start to have their own separate culture, and they remain independent and resist every attempt by the Anglo-Saxons and later the Kingdom of England to invade, conquer, and subjugate. The Vikings are there pretty much doing what they will, though. They're at the mercy of the Vikings because the Vikings go around by ship and they just attack up the rivers and the inlets and the fjords, and the Scots are almost helpless to protect themselves against the Vikings. So in the northern part of Scotland, there is a huge Viking influence. And I mentioned Orkney in another class. If you're in the conversation classes, we talked about vacations. Orkney is a beautiful, breathtakingly beautiful part of northern Scotland, which has a very, very strong influence by the Vikings, because it really was Viking territory for hundreds and hundreds of years. Now, let's get back to chapter 1 and talk about what's going on with the rest of the chapter. So there's a picture of Orkney there. As I said, if you look up a place called Skara Brae, you can see some of the original inhabitants built a small town there. So let's talk about the important people here. We already talked about Boudica. She's the first hero, and she is a woman. No coincidence there, because I try to choose more women every semester to add a few in, because they're disproportionately represented. But the rest of the ones today are men. I think I better talk about King Arthur next, because he's supposedly a Romano-Briton. He's supposed to be, it's a weird appropriation. This is what we would call cultural appropriation, definitely these days. Basically, he's supposed to be a Romano-Briton. So he's a king or a warlord, I guess. So when the Angles and the Saxons come and they start fighting and taking over England and pushing, the Bretons back, some of them actually leave and they move to northwestern France. That's why there's Breton, which is Brittany in English, was colonized by Romano-Britons trying to get away from these savage raiders from Germany. So they fight, and it's a very gradual process. And like I said, archaeologically speaking, it's not really like a bloody genocidal conquering. It's not like what Julius Caesar did to Gaul, because that's a very famous story, how there were millions of Celts living in Gaul, and when Julius Caesar conquered France, he destroyed it so completely that the population was depleted. He killed probably half of them, maybe 1 million of them. Hundreds of thousands of them became slaves, and it became so completely dominated by Roman culture that even when the Roman Empire collapsed, Charlemagne recreated the Holy Roman Empire in France and conquered Europe again in 800 AD because the culture had so completely been eradicated, subjugated, and crushed. That's not what happened when the Germans came, when the Angles and the Saxons came. There was a lot more blending, there was fighting, but one of the figures of resistance standing up against this, dark future and waves of invaders from the continent was a person supposedly called King Arthur. Now there's a speculation about some hero, warlord king being actually a real person, but it doesn't really match the story, because the story of King Arthur actually gets written hundreds and hundreds of years later. So the real King Arthur, or King Arthur figure, probably lived in the 5th century, around 500 AD, and he probably was nothing like the King Arthur. He didn't pull a sword out of the stone. He may have been Christianized. That could have been true. But he certainly didn't have a court called Camelot that we know of. And all of the details they added was Sir Lancelot and Lady Guinevere and all that stuff. That's all romantic, nation-building myth. They created this heroic figure who represented Britain. And every subsequent, culture, except for the Anglo-Saxons, but once the Anglo-Saxons sort of resolved themselves into a kingdom that included Welsh, Gaelic, Bretons, right? Brittonic people, Britons, Angles, Saxons, Jutes, and Danes. It's really like a multicultural nation. And some scholars believe that England was the first nation state in the world, not just in Europe, but in the world. And this is because these kingdoms, they formed 7 of them. It's called the Heptarchy, and they all had basic similar rules, and they all contended with each other, but they had they started to have a common language, a common culture, and a participation in government, right? So it wasn't like an empire, right, where one group of people was ruling over another. The classes started to meld with each other. So there was Danish or half Danish and Angles and Saxons, and they all started mixing together, and then they all started to take on the identity of Anglo-Saxon. Like, you just stopped calling yourself a Dane and started calling yourself an Anglo-Saxon. Like, Saxons stopped calling themselves Saxons, and Angles stopped calling themselves Angles. They called themselves Anglo-Saxons, right? And they settled on the name England, and they called them King of the Angloi. So all of these identities start to merge to create this. And probably the most important person, there is a monk called Bede, which I didn't include in the book yet, so I'm gonna skip over him, but he is instrumental in excuse me, that was unplanned. Bede is a monk who lives in Jarrow in Northumbria, and he writes a history of the Anglois. And this kind of defines them as a Christian kingdom that is one unified thing. That this island, sometimes they call it Britain, sometimes they call it Britannia, sometimes Brittany. There's various words in Latin. He wrote all of this in Latin, describing it as one solid state, which had the effect, of legitimizing England as a kingdom in Christendom, in all of the Christian church across Europe, and helped the people living there identify themselves as this chosen people, the English. And we'll talk about how the English think they're a chosen people quite a bit later, and it's also an American thing. So that started with Bede, and then there was a king who was born named Alfred, and I'm going to have to get you to read some of these things yourself. But King Alfred, he was born in Wessex, and his father was Ethelred, and his father was the first one to claim the dominion over the Angles and the Saxons. But he's actually, Wessex means West Saxon, so he's the king of the West Saxons. But all of the other kingdoms have been taken over, raided, or downgraded, or thrown into chaos by Viking raids. It's just one by one, the Vikings are picking off every kingdom, and Wessex is basically the only one left. And Alfred isn't even the oldest. He's not supposed to be the next king anyway, but his older brothers die. He does something interesting when he's young. His father sends him on a pilgrimage to Rome, so he goes all the way to Rome to meet the Pope, and the Pope, does a ceremony blessing him. And in retrospect, everybody thinks, well, the Pope, it was his destiny to become king, because he went 3,000 kilometers, which would have taken months and been very dangerous, all the way to Rome. Met the Pope. The Pope gave him his blessing as a prince of the royal blood, and he comes back. His brothers die, and so he becomes the king. He's actually kind of not that healthy. He's got stomach problems and stuff, so he's kind of sick half the time. He's kind of like Caesar Augustus that way, if you know. Maybe you don't. I'm a big Roman history fan. So Caesar Augustus wasn't a very healthy guy, but he lived forever, despite the fact that everybody thought he was going to die all the time. King Alfred the Great was also kind of plagued by stomach issues and stuff. So he was not in good condition for most of his life. However, obviously his mind was very keen, and his will was very strong. And despite the weakness of his body, he did lead. He was a military leader, and he was successful, charismatic, inspiring to his troops. He rallied the English, Saxons, the West Saxons, and he defeated. His strategy was to protect Wessex, and he succeeded in doing that enough that he wore down the Vikings, and they didn't have the men or the resources or the desire to take over his kingdom. So he made an agreement with the Danes that they would control the northern part of England, and that would be called the Danelaw, and the southern part would be consolidated into an Anglo-Saxon kingdom. And that's where from that small kingdom of Wessex, and you can see the size of this, it's really like a pocket in the south of England. From that corner, which he managed to save, he starts expanding out, and then his children and his grandchildren push back the Vikings until they push back the Vikings into the north, and then eventually they become the dominant culture, and the northern Viking culture kind of folds into the English culture, and like I said, they become the ones that are the subculture. So the counterculture grows and grows until it becomes dominant again, and then a truly unified Anglo-Saxon kingdom appears. Although the far north, like York, where Northumbria is, still remains very Danish, but they're being absorbed by a dominant Anglo-Saxon culture. And so we're getting, the formation of England. So you could say King Alfred is the father of the English nation, at least the English kingdom, right? He's the father of the English kingdom, just the way you treat Sejong or his ancestor Sejong as the founders of the Chosun dynasty. Okay? So that's why he's so important. He is kind of like Sejong in the fact that he was very educated. He knew multiple languages. He encouraged art and literature. He regulated taxation and military service. He established a code of laws called the Doom Book, which is a law book. He was a devout Christian, and he translated as many things as he could into English. He also took stock of all of the resources. He tried to build some ships so that he could fight against the Vikings on the water. He's a pretty amazing guy, and that's why he gets the title the Great. And he's the only Anglo-Saxon king to get the title the Great. But there's one more who gets the title too, because the one problem with the English monarchy throughout its history up until 300 years ago, and up until the monarchy becomes connected to Germany with the Hanovers, there's about 1,000 years of English kings and queens having constant trouble with who's going to be king next, because either there's no boys, too many boys, or a boy king. You've got three different problems here. So you got no boys, so we don't know it's going to be a cousin or something, or it's going to be a girl who becomes the next king or queen. That's a problem. Who's next? Just basic problem. If you die early, if the king dies, which is usually the case in the English situation, the king dies, but the boy is only like 3 years old or 5 years old. So he doesn't have he can't rule. So other people control him like a puppet. This happens a lot in Korean history too. And either that boy gets controlled too much and grows up and becomes a crazy king, or he gets killed and somebody takes over for him, or he grows up and there's some sort of power struggle. There's various possibilities, but having a boy king is always a bad thing. It's very rare that a boy gets raised properly, and then the power transfer to the young king works out. It happens, but it's not a stable situation, especially while the boy is growing up. Then there's the last one, and they can't win because sometimes these English kings just have like 6 boys or something like that, 4, 5, 6 boys. And then in England, actually you're supposed to choose your successor. It's not necessarily supposed to be the first child. So then you have the problem of, if you choose the third one, the first one's going to resent it. And if you give it to the first one, the rest of them are going to all resent the first one. So you end up with, civil war between your children, which is a very common thing in history in other countries. But since England was relatively stable otherwise, this kind of just caused a lot of problems with their culture, their country, their economy, their political system. It's a constant problem. Every time the king, dies or gets sick or gets old or has problems having children, everybody in the kingdom gets nervous. And it'll happen again and again, you'll see. So this is what happens to the line. That's what happens. You got boy kings. I'm not going to go through them all, but you end up with basically a Danish, high king who has control over Scandinavia, Scotland, Ireland, and England at the same time. And his name is Canute. And since there isn't any other options, and part of England is Danish anyway, he gets accepted And he's not a bad king. It's not a bad thing. He gets accepted as the King of England. So he's the king of the Danes, the king of the Swedes, king of Scotland and England and Ireland. He's got control of this whole North Sea Empire. And he has two sons, and he grows up and he takes, an Anglo-Saxon wife named Emma. And, he rules he's famous for being logical and, powerful and respected. He goes all over the place. He goes to Europe and he goes to Scandinavia and Russia, and he's well known, and he makes England more famous and more respected. Afterwards in history, they kind of tried to damage his reputation because the people who conquer England next don't want any heroes from other groups. So that's Canute. But unfortunately, Canute's, again, he has the same chronic problem that England does. He's got one son who's unacceptable because he's crazy and unruly and unreliable, and he ends up in Sweden over there, and nobody wants him to be the king in England anyway. And then several of his sons die. So there is nobody to take the throne. So it ends up being this boy who ran away when Canute became king to Normandy, which is also kind of a Norse kingdom. His name is Edward, and he grows up in northern France with the Duke of Normandy, and then he comes back. And this sets up a problem now, because there's like a triangle. There's the Anglo-Saxon England kingdom, there's the Normans who raised the King of England and expect to be good friends with him, and then there's the Danish, the Vikings, who still expect to be part of the English system too, because Canute was their king. So the last king was Danish, but the king before that was Anglo-Saxon, and the current king is raised by Normans. So we've got three kingdoms that really want to control England, okay? So Edward the Confessor, he's not really your ideal king. He's not a warrior, he's more like a priest. He has a wife, but he doesn't have any kids. So this is a problem. He gets married and he rules for 24 years, and it's relatively stable. And since, as I said, people liked Canute, but before and after Canute, everything was unstable, they kind of liked Edward the Confessor's reign because he was reasonable and there was a balance in the kingdom, and his rule. He was very concerned with praying and studying more than he was with making war or taxing and stuff like that. So the people were basically left largely alone without having to commit a lot to the kingdom. So he was probably more popular. Now, looking after that, all the great kings, warrior kings later that took over, other countries and, came up with new law systems and everything, they make him look a little bit lazy, kind of listless and ineffectual, and that he was controlled by, a powerful court of nobles. And some of that may be true, but essentially he managed the kingdom reasonably well. And then he died with no children. When he died, there was this guy called Harold Godwinson, and his father was the most powerful noble in England. And so he arranged for Harold to take over, even though by blood there were other options, right? So one of the options was the great grandson of Emma, the Queen of England, was in fact William, Duke of Normandy. So he said he had a claim to the throne as well. And then there were some Danish people that said, well, Canute was the King of England, and we also have a claim to the throne. And Harold's own brother, Tostig, was decided to join the Danes and help them, because he was jealous of his brother Harold, and he wanted to be the king too. So that sets up this triangular power struggle, which will result in an event in 1066. That is the most important date in English history. So that is for after the quiz. I will talk about the Norman Conquest in 1066 next class. But that's all you need to know. That's right to the end of chapter 1. Okay, so I just summarized right to the end of chapter 1. So just remember, don't forget about the dominant, counter, and subculture stuff I mentioned from the introduction. And then read chapter 1, check your notes, watch the video lecture, make sure you log in to Cyber Campus and do your Google Forms quiz on Friday at 10, and everything will be fine and dandy. Okay, thank you for listening. That's it for today's lecture. This will be uploaded on Wednesday, and I hope everything goes well for you on Friday. Have a nice day.